He's a senior in NVIDIA, and he has been working in a lot of cool stuff, among which is a lot of scientific applications, along with core ML algorithms, especially tensor algebraic formulations. We've worked actually a little bit together on that. We know each other with Jan for several years, and I've always been a big fan of what he's been doing. So very much looking forward to what he will do present today. Before NVIDIA, Jan was a research scientist in Samsung in UK. And before that, he completed a PhD in Imperial College London. And he will be presenting today a little bit about doing neural operators, which is one of the very important topics in the last few years in ML, with important applications on AI for science. Jean, really looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much for the great introduction. Yeah, it's also my great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Madison. Yeah, also a big fan of Grigorius's work. So if there are any students who wants to work on full stack, actually many really great people at Madison. So you guys are really lucky, except for the weather. Actually the coldest weather I've ever seen in my life so far. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about neural operators and how we can use them for scientific applications. So just to get an idea, how many of you already are familiar with neural operators? Okay, great. So I think, yeah, I was told that's the great thing, that this is very interdisciplinary. So hopefully everyone can get something from it. So yeah, first I'm going to give an introduction, an overview of neural operators, what they are and how they work. So yeah, then I'm going to talk about how we can implement them in practice for, depending on your problem, whether it's a uniform discretization, maybe you have some symmetries in your problem, or if you have arbitrary geometries. And so yeah, this is all machine learning. So it's learning from data. So I'm going to touch briefly on how we can add physics constraints. And finally, I have a bit on hardware considerations and how we can actually use tensor methods within this. And lastly, we're going to talk a bit about software. We're a big fan of open source software. So actually, most of the work we do is open source. So you guys can also try it. So yeah, I guess the main motivation for neural operators is the fact that most of the interesting phenomena we're interested in happen at multiple scale. And they're typically governed by mathematical equations. For example, one big example that we have is like the Navier-Stokes equation, which are partial differential equations that describe the motion of viscous fluids. And so the solution to these, so anyway, we're interested in basically looking at physical processes. Those are typically functions, the solution are functions. And so we want to be able to actually learn mappings between functions. So one typical example would be weather forecasting, which is very needed if you want to do things like wildfire prevention, water management, crop forecasting. And if we were able to actually speed up even the current models, we would be able to do better probabilistic estimates. And as you know, like weather and climate disasters are quite unexpected because by definition, they are tail events, so like these black events. So if we want to model these, we want to be able to actually capture the whole probability distribution, and so the tail events. And to do this, we need sufficiently large ensembles or sufficiently good probabilistic estimates. And so now, why is this problem of interest to us? Well, because it's actually a fairly complex problem. I said that most of the problems we're interested in are governed by equations. Here, the equations aren't known. We know some of it, but we don't really know exactly how to model the system. So it's really where we want to learn from data. And then the scale of this data makes the problem challenging. I mentioned like things happen on multiple scale. So here right now, most of the models we currently work on are at about 0.25 degrees. So that's 25 kilometers resolution. And so, yeah, that's where we're at. And we can model large scale dynamics. If we want to go further, like model storms, we need to go to the 1 kilometer scale. And if we want to model resolve things like clouds, we need to go below 1 kilometer scale. And so as we do this, both the compute and the storage become a problem. Like for 25 kilometers, we're about tens of terabytes. 1 kilometer would be about 500 terabytes. And then if you want to go below this, we hit the petabytes. So storing this data is a problem. How to even then feed this data to our GPUs, how to train on this, that becomes a real issue. And so this is where we might want to look at things like neural operator. And the whole idea of neural operator is instead of neural network, which will map between finite dimensional spaces, like an image to image problem, or like a vector to vector, you now want to learn an operator that will learn a mapping between functions. So if you train a neural network on an image, you basically fix your resolution, and you can only do inference at images or input at that same resolution. The idea is we would want an operator that you can train an inference on data or functions given at any resolution on discrete data. And so one important thing I want to mention here is that we would like to decouple resolution and number of parameters. If you have something like a UNet, for example, like a regular neural network, you can train it at different resolution, but the higher your resolution, the more parameters you need. And so things, for weather, for example, that I showed before, things would quickly become too large to actually fit. Well, here we would want to decouple the parameters from the resolution. And so an important property, and probably like the key property for a neural operator, is something called discretization convergence, because you could build something that just works at any resolution, but as you increase the resolution, things become nonsensical. So here, for example, if you want to model the flow around an airfoil, you train at an initial discretization that that may be fast, but as you refine your discretization, you would want your operator to converge to a unique, sensible solution. And so this is called the discretization convergence, and it's kind of one of the key properties of neural operators. So now I'm going to show how we can actually build those and cover things like, do we have a universal approximation theorem for them, for example? I think we're all familiar with neural networks, but I wanted just to make the equivalence, make the link between a perceptron and what would be the equivalence in function space. So perceptron, I don't know why we name things like this. I feel like it's very proper to our field. In biology, for example, they have the coolest things. They gave them very boring name. Like, I don't know, CRISPR sounds like a setting on a toaster machine, but it's actually edits DNA. We have perceptron, which is just a linear layer. And then we can stack multi-layer perceptrons into transformer and add flash attention. That's just math lecture. So anyway, so the perceptron is just a linear layer, a fully connected layer, which will take a set of points. So here the f1 to fn. So they can be from an underlying function, but they're a fixed set of. We have this fixed discretization, and we want to learn a mapping between this input vector to an output vector here, like the j1 to j8. And I think one have probably seen this picture, but the idea is you basically just learn this function phi, which is your perceptron, your layer, that will map your input f to your output g. And how it does this is by learning a set of parameters. So here the matrix K, and you just, each output of J, each output is a linear combination of the inputs plus potentially some bias. And so now the equivalence in function space would be, we actually have the underlying function and we want to learn a mapping between the two. So obviously when we're implementing this on a computer, we can't give the full function, but we want to be able to give different types of discretization. The input and output might be defined on different meshes, or we may have different observations. And so now the problem is to learn an operator where the inputs are no longer vectors, they're functions, and so are the outputs. And so the way you do this is, so instead of your perceptron, you get an operator here, just a simple linear integral transform. And then you map between the functions. And so the key thing here is that we replace our matrix, our kernel K, by now a function, which becomes our kernel. And so now we can query that kernel at any points. And so now this sum becomes a linear combination of the evaluations of your functions at your discretization points. And I've added this little delta I here, which is just like the quadrature weights. And so you probably recognize the Riemannian sum approximation to the integral. And so the nice thing is that if your quadrature is correct, this will converge to the actual integral. So you converge to something sensible at the limit. And so this integral at the bottom is the linear integral transformation, and it's kind of the building blocks of neural operators. And so, yeah, this was just a simple illustration. So the quadrature weights, you can pick them to be like 1/n if you have a uniform discretization, but in general, if you have a point cloud, if you sample some areas more densely and you pogo those quadrature weights, things don't converge to the right side anymore.
So is this particular to linear operators?
Oh, that's a good question. So the transform is linear. So we use the linear kernel integral transform as the building block, but then on top we add nonlinearity. So the same way like perceptron alone just cannot do anything, you need to add nonlinearities in multiple layers. It's the same here. So typically you take your input function f. We typically have a lifting layer or like an encoder, which basically takes the function and lifts it to a higher dimensional space. So basically more channels. And then we have a series of neural operator layer where you apply this some form of this kernel integral. You apply then a nonlinearity, perhaps some normalization to stabilize training. And then at the end, after this succession of layers, you have a projection layer to project back to your original space from the lifted space to the original one. And that gives you your... And so I mentioned earlier, like, do we have a universal approximation theorem? It turns out that yes, actually, the proof is fairly complex. Actually, two of my colleagues, like Nikola Kovacsky and Zongili, did it in the JMLR paper that I showed earlier. But basically, the formulation is very simple. In the discrete space, we know that for any continuous function f, there exists a neural network with given width that can approximate arbitrarily well that function. And so in function space, things basically work the same. So for any continuous input operator now, so that maps between functions instead of vectors, there exists a neural operator that can approximate arbitrarily well this operator. So that doesn't tell us we can learn it in practice, but it tells at least it exists. So there is hope to do things. And so, yeah, I should mention that these neural operators, we learn them like neural networks, just gradient backpropagation. You feed data through your operator, computer loss, and then apply the chain rule.
Just a question about the theorem. Does it require multiple layers, or is it just like the usual thing? One nonlinear layer would give you approximation.
Yeah, I think it's probably like at least 2 layers with nonlinearities.
Right.
And the operator
it has to be.
No, it doesn't tell you anything about the form or what it looks like. It could be too large to actually fit in memory.
When going from one to the other, was there a simple sort of transition, or did you, not you personally, but like the mathematicians behind it, did they have to rederive a lot of things from scratch to fit the operator space?
Yeah, things are quite different when you go from finite dimensional to dimensional space. Yeah.
Okay, so it's convenient that ended up.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's more convoluted if you actually go through the detail.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So you say continuous operator, what are the spaces PF and D? What topology do they have?
Oh, yeah, this is like a very rough definition. It's basically just 2 function spaces and that are compact, basically. That's the main. So yeah, this is a fairly abstract definition. And so in practice, we don't typically implement this integral transform because that would be fairly inefficient. And so I'm going to show a few of the actual implementations of these neural operators. The first one is
one more question on the previous thing, the absolute value, like the notion of epsilon. I mean, that's like, because it's differences between functions. That's some sort of total variation norm or something like that. Like what is the?
Yeah, I think it's like it should have been a superior, like the sup of over the function. Yeah, sorry, it was very hand wavy.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, actually, turns out PowerPoint is not great to write later. It's very painful. So yeah, where you have a uniform discretization of both your input and output function. And so in that case, you can again start from your integral linear operator. And just here, we choose to use a global convolution operator, which is just a special case. So as you probably know, the convolutional theorem tells you that you can actually do all of this in Fourier space, which can be a lot more efficient. And so the way you would do this is you have your input function at a given discretization, you apply Fourier transform, then you multiply with the Fourier transform of your weights. This is some kind of mixing. Basically, you take the coefficients in the spectral domain, you mix them in some way, in some learnable way, and then you invert the transform to go back to the original space. So what this says is basically, you take your input function, you project it to a fixed basis space. In this case, it's a Fourier basis functions. Then so it's a fixed basis, so it means you truncate some of the coefficients. In practice, we keep the low frequencies and we discard the high frequencies. You do some kind of mixing. You hear element-wise multiplication by learnable weights, meaning you do a convolution in original space, and you undo the transformation. And what's nice is that you can realize the Fourier transform very efficiently. If you use the fast Fourier transform on the uniform grid, you get something that's O of n log n instead of O of n squared. So it's very efficient to do. And then the full operator basically ends up being a succession of this spectral convolution. And you can notice that I added this residual connection in between. They're quite important for two reasons. One, it allows, when you train via gradient backpropagation, it allows gradient to flow through. And the other reason is that, as I mentioned, in the spectral domain, we truncate some of the frequencies. So the residual connection allows you to recover high frequency information and also non-periodic information, because the Fourier transform will make periodic. So yeah, that's basically the Fourier neural operator. I think it's probably the most known neural operator.
Can I ask a question about this? What you're saying, I want to see if I understand that, like, you're not considering the entire ridiculous, gigantic space of possible linear operators. You're cutting it down to even this very restricted class of linear operator.
Yeah, exactly. So here we use Fourier basis, where we could use like wavelet transform, basically a fixed basis function. And yeah, they have to be set so that, yeah, even if you change the resolution of your problem, you're still projecting them onto the same basis functions.
Could you talk a little more about that residual connection? Because here you are, you know, particularly like in NWP, what you see is there's skill at larger scales, but that vective scale is not skillful.
Okay.
How does that residual that you're throwing out pull back on the larger scale that you're resolving?
So yeah, here basically the spectral convolution, because we're truncating the high frequencies, would lose all that high frequency information. So it's basically just a way to recover it. And so it typically, instead of just passing the identity, it would still be some learnable function. For example, you have n functions. I mentioned you lift the problem to a higher dimensional. So if you have functions, maybe you lift it to like 32 channels or 32 functions. And so you can do, for example, some channel mixing. So you can do each output function could be a linear combination of the other. So it's still a learnable function.
I think there maybe is a language gap there. Residual connection there basically means the identity. You're taking the identity and just passing along, and you're adding it to whatever came out of it. It's called spectral convolution. So in that sense, if there's a bunch of high frequency, but you get an opportunity to regain it, but it's not residual in the sense of difference between, like, you're reconstructed in some ground truth or something, which is, I think, how you may be using it. So.
Yes, sorry, yeah. But yeah, residual here means by default the identity or like some learnable version of that.
Okay, thank you.
And so, yeah, in practice, so this is an example on the Kolmogorov flows. So here it was an FNO trained on 64 by 64 inputs. And the prediction here is done at 256 by 256. So initial conditions are given at higher resolution that the model hasn't seen during training. And so, yeah, one of the ways of visualizing the fact that it kind of learns better is if you look at the spectrogram. So you can see that the energy that haven't seen a better model than a neural network that you would train. So a neural network, you could interpolate your inputs and still interpolate it down and feed it to your model. And in this case, the spectrogram would look a little worse than it does if you actually train a neural operator. And so the ground truth is this gray line here. So yeah, the neural operator is able to learn fairly well the structure.
I'm not really clear on how this is discretization invariant. So if your curly F is the thing that's like doing the lifting, and then R is the operator that you're learning. Yeah, how is that invariant to whatever you're discretizing to?
So the lifting is only on the channels, or like on your functions. So if you have a two input function like velocity and the pressure, you just lift that to say 32. So it's just to over-parameterize your network and allow good learning via gradient by propagation. But this doesn't touch the spatial dimension. It's pointwise in this way. So it doesn't matter the resolution, you can always do that. And then the Fourier neural operator, the spectral convolution is doesn't depend on the spatial resolution since we have a fixed basis function.
I see.
So how would this be different than just taking the Fourier transform of your input, running it through a regular neural network, and then taking the inverse Fourier transform at the end? Right, you still have this Fourier discretization, just putting it in.
I see. Okay, so in this case, you would work only on the Fourier coefficient. But the problem is then you actually lose all the high-frequency information.
But well, here, then can't I play this residual trick there? In that case?
But then you're literally passing the input. Here it's still learnable. It's still learnable layers. And there's also the lifting. Actually,
is there not a way that I could do that just with my Fourier coefficient?
I don't think we probably could try. I don't think it would work as well. But I mean, there are things like this in vision. For example, the new diffusion model, you would apply half features, then pass this to your neural networks. Instead of working directly on the input, you can work directly on Fourier coefficient. But the point is you still need sufficiently deep network with sufficient representational power. It's like if you train a tiny transformer for language, it's not actually going to perform well. You need a model that's large and has enough capacity. But what you're saying is, yes, there's more than one way to build a neural operator, and that's the whole point. The only thing you want to make sure is that it's discretization convergence. So as you increase the resolution, it's going to converge to something. And here, as you increase the discretization, this will actually converge to the true Fourier transform. And so your integral, it will converge to the actual integral. So yeah, that was for learning on a regular grid. Now there are other cases. So I was talking about weather earlier. So there's some kinds of equivariances. We're actually dealing with data that's defined on a sphere.
Can I just ask a question about convergence? So is there something more going on than just like you're insisting that match on the grid? So if the grid gets finer and finer, it somehow has to be consistently converging, or is there something else involved? Like, I mean, it doesn't really say anything about this extrapolation capability.
Oh, no, it might, yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean the solution will be correct. It just means that it converges to a unique solution. And it's not going to, for example, start oscillating, or if you overfit it to your set of observation parameter, like go to something completely extravagant at the limits. And so the spectrum will stay coherent. So yeah, so for the actual weather forecasting, the data is, I don't know if you're familiar, it's called ERA5. It's from the ECMWF, so the European Weather and Climate Agency. It's this 25-kilometer resolution data. It's about 40 years of data, and it has things like temperature at different altitudes, potential heights, etc. And so the primary, you get your input, your data at a given date, and you want to predict how will it look like 6 hours later, 12 hours later, days later, etc. And so the idea here is exactly the same as the Fourier neural operator, except now we're on the sphere. So instead of using Fourier basis, we actually learn basis function on the sphere. So that would be like spherical harmonic. And so, yeah, basically the idea is instead of applying FFT, now you apply your harmonic transform, apply some learnable weights, and invert the transformation. And you have a sequence of those with those skip connections. So the identity residual. And so just doing this, actually, so it works well, but more importantly, it stays coherent if you unroll over very long periods of time. So it doesn't mean it's correct, it's still a chaotic system, but at least it's a reasonable prediction. While something like a transformer goes to something nonsensical, you can see kind of patching artifacts. And so it's probably due to the fact that a transformer would work on some form of projection. So you take your spherical data, project it on a grid, like lat long or like equiangular grid, and that would basically deform the poles with the same amount of space as the equators. Well, if you work directly on the sphere, you actually can leverage this equivariance and land directly there.
In all of those simulations, is there an equivalent? So you have some learnable parameters, right? In those. I assume they would be equivalent with like billions of parameters, right? Or they require, what's the scale of learnable parameters in the training?
Yeah, it's actually similar to what neural networks would be like hundreds of, yeah, probably hundreds of millions. You can scale billion parameter, or however much memory you can actually afford. Typically, the larger the models, the better.
But I understand, right? You have some space of functions you're allowed to convolve with, right? And that's your parameter. That's telling you that's sort of the equivalent of the number of parameters.
So the parameters here are the learnable weights. Yeah, in that basis function, you project to a basis function, and then here we do a convolution, so like an element-wise multiplication in that space. So if you have, say, 128 function by height times width, then your weight would be of that size. Well, multiplied by output channels.
With some method, like a heel fixing, you don't know it, but where you end up covering the sphere rhombi that kind of equal area, would that help you at all?
So yeah, that's a great question. So Helpix is great. Actually, you can do. I have a colleague who's actually implemented. Boris Bonneff, who implemented these spherical harmonics. He also is working on doing spherical harmonics on Helpix. And Helpix is great for doing spherical harmonics. So you could still do this on Helpix grid. The point is, do you mean using directly the patches of the Helpix grid and use like a transformer on them?
I didn't think about it that much.
But because the issue is that here is you still have the equivariance, so it doesn't matter how you rotate your sphere. Well, if you consider the patches, you would have to basically memorize how the patches were connected originally and pad across patches such that the neighbor of each patch is its actual neighbor on the sphere. Well, if you just put them on a 2D plane, you might lose this relationship. And then at the end, you have to put it back on the sphere.
So like I have a question about the like when you train, like in the example you showed, you training had only seen 64 by 54. So while like in the limit, like if the training grid size was like larger and larger, then it like they could cut like there's convergence. But in terms of like in practice, you'll have like certain resolution at which we learn. That leads to some approximation.
Yes.
So how do we think about like when I input something at a higher resolution, like in terms of like let's say like you're like visualizing back in the original space, like what is like the kind of confidence you can have in a way, like isn't the approximation somehow limited by the original discretization?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't tell. It's not guaranteed to generalize well. Like it could give you something wrong. It could hallucinate data that is wrong. See, if it has never seen this kind of dynamics, it's possible that you can still somewhat learn the dynamics at lower resolution. But if you cannot, yes, you cannot hallucinate it. However, because you can feed data at different resolution, if you have this case, you probably would fine tune on some of the higher resolution data, so that the model can actually incorporate that. So what you would do typically is maybe start training at low resolution and then fine tune. So there's a paper called incremental Fourier neural operator, which does exactly this. You can incrementally increase both the resolution and potentially the number of basis functions you have.
That's interesting. Thank you.
And so yeah, I think that was just basically ends up being a lot faster than running a numerical simulator, obviously, because once you've trained the model, you can just pass data through. And so This is just an example of what I was mentioning earlier about doing probabilistic estimation. So this is Hurricane Harvey 2017 in Houston. And so, yeah, in blue is the observed trajectory. In orange was the predicted one. As you can see, if you just predict a mean, you're very likely to miss the true trajectory, while if you predict an ensemble, you're much more likely to capture the extremes. And so, yeah, that's basically the point, that if you have a method that is fast, we're not saying that it's going to beat numerical solvers. It probably won't. You can get arbitrarily good performance with your solver. The point is you can then use this data to train an operator that will be able to do simulation very, very fast. And so you can run tens of thousands of simulations, and then from those get a better estimation of your probability distribution. So here, for example, if you just do a few runs, you only get basically the mean of the distribution. Well, otherwise you can actually capture more accurately the full probability distribution. And so the tail events, which really the extreme winds here are what we care about. And so yeah, the point is that we wouldn't necessarily expect to beat a numerical solver. It's more we use them to then being able to speed up in cases where we need to do very, very large ensembles.
But couldn't it be that, I mean, you're testing your, if any neural testing against data and matching blah, 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 but wouldn't the tail events be what you would be least confident about because you haven't really seen them? Like, I'm curious, like, how much I would rely on these kind of tail estimate probabilities. Like, it seems exactly the sort of.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I agree. But the point stands, I think, in general with the solver as well. Like, the whole point is, you will simulate them less often, but at least you're still, if you have a large enough ensemble, you can still reason about the spread and maybe the probabilities.
The input, you vary the inputs and then run, like, what's changing?
But yeah, so typically, yes, so some form of perturbation of the initial conditions or different models. You can perturb the model again.
Yeah, how do you evaluate whether these probability distributions are well calibrated, or how do you evaluate?
So yeah, so I'm not an expert on that probably, but yeah, basically they measure whether the ensemble is well calibrated. There's a whole set of metrics to check what's the spread. So you want base models that are not under dispersive, and then you want your ensemble to be well calibrated. I think that's a whole recent question. They did this, but I'm not sure.
I think the key here is that the traditional NWP is already doing exactly this, and there's a whole set of literature about, ensemble, except now you increase the number of ensemble members, which is a huge advantage.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so yeah, that was so all of this was still on structured grids. We had a regular grid, we had a sphere, but it's still fairly nicely behaved data. And so the last type of data I want to mention is arbitrary geometries, which are actually quite important. And one particular use case we had was 3D aerodynamics. So typically you're given an input geometry, let's say a car geometry, and you want to estimate the surface pressure on the car and ultimately, for example, the drag. And the applications would be, if you modify your geometry, how does it affect the drag, or vice versa? Can you actually modify the geometry in order to minimize the drag? And so we run experiments on two types of data sets. One is the car CFD data sets that takes about an hour on CPU to generate. That's a little simplistic. And then we had the Ahmed body data set, which it's simplistic shapes that more or less it's kind of in this industry standard benchmark that approximates well the actual dynamics. And so doing good simulations on those was actually quite costly. It took about 10 hours for each simulation on 2 V100 GPUs. And so the goal there would be, and also I should mention that doing this simulation is actually quite labor intensive. It's not fully automatic. You still have to refine the mesh, do a lot of manual labor. Could we actually take this data and then train a surrogate model that can just do this in one shot? And so this is what we did with what we call the graph neural operator. And the idea is that you can have point clouds as inputs and point clouds as output, which means you basically query your model at any point. And this means that you can train your model at different discretizations, but also the geometry is not fixed. So each car can have a different number of points. Obviously, the points are going to be in different locations, so you can't rely on a fixed geometry here. And the way the graph neural operator works is, once again, you start with the same linear kernel integral, except now you're going to do this integration in a fixed neighborhood. For each query point, you find all the neighbors within an epsilon ball neighborhood of that point, and you basically aggregate the information from those neighboring points through a learnable kernel here, which you can parameterize with a MLP or whatever you like. And so the key thing here is that if you just use nearest neighbors, as you increase the resolution, your operator becomes increasingly local, which is problematic, especially if you have high density on some areas and not. Well, here you keep the neighborhood fixed no matter the resolution, which means that you're always aggregating over the same region.
But in practice, that integral, you mean like it's a sum over all the points that were within
the neighborhood,
volatile size, more and more points as the
yeah, exactly. And doing the neighborhood search is also costly. You actually need to go and find all the points in the neighborhood, which is actually, once you have them, it's quick to sum up them.
Can I clarify something? So I mean, there's two pictures of this. So like one is that there's an ambient 3D geometry changing at all, in which case it's like the first part of the talk. But I think what you're saying really, you're matching like some 2D surface that has some intrinsic geometry, and that you're doing like, that's where there's like the graph neural network is describing this mesh, which is like the surface of the car.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that from one car to another is changing, not the ambient 3D.
Oh, right. Yeah, yes, exactly.
I think that, because otherwise, yeah. Okay.
All right. Yeah, sorry. So in this case, the input is the point cloud. So it's the mesh. And from this mesh, I try to predict the surface pressure and directly the drag. So for the drag, you basically would integrate over the surface pressure with the shear and normals, and then get one value, and you can back propagate through it all.
But you have another dimension to capture the aerodynamics from this mesh, right?
It's in 3D space. So it's a point cloud actually. It's a point cloud in 3D, and so we take this as input, take the point locations, and then from this we predict the solution.
But no time dependence.
Not here. Ideally we would have it here. Yeah, we assume that we're in the transient state and scale up.
How do you predict, like, if you don't have a velocity or acceleration or both?
Well, you assume that is fixed. So like you assume, for example, you have like your car in a wind tunnel with a fixed velocity, and you just try to measure the drag. Then we could try to parameterize this, but then it becomes a lot more complicated. And we need to probably make the model dependent on the inlet velocity and feed its data at different velocities.
Yeah, because then like I assume the graph or the 3D point cloud becomes deformable, right? Because the pressure on the car would vary on where you are, right?
Depending on the inlet velocity, yes, the pressure on the car would change. Yeah, so this is for a fixed inlet velocity. And so as you mentioned, it's still very costly to do this because you need to find the neighbors, you need to aggregate around each neighbor, and you need to do this for each point. So you have millions of points that can become quite costly on GPU. So one nice thing is that I mentioned you can query the graph neural operator anywhere you want. So what we did here is we have one GNO layer that basically encodes the geometry into a regular mesh. So you just query it on the uniform grid. Then we apply a Fourier neural operator because it's very efficient thanks to the FFT-based methods. And then at the end, we have another graph neural operator that decodes back to the geometry we want. So then we just query the GNO at all the points.
So in which of these boxes are there infinite dimensional function space? The function on the graph, that's finite, right? There's only finite. Only in the middle that you have your actual sort of function spaces and operators. And
yeah, I guess this one, the input is just the geometry, rather than the output is the pressure on the surface of the car, which is continuous. And then there you would want to be able to query at different resolutions.
I guess I'm not quite catching how this ties into the actual CFP problem that you have to solve. which changes with every geometry.
Right, so here the input is the geometry. So we learned the operator that maps the geometry to the corresponding drag, assuming.
Okay, so the CFD simulations are the data. So you have input, which is fluid velocity, output, which are the stress distribution on your car. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we use those simulations I mentioned earlier to train the methods.
So, but this isn't helping with the resolution issue of that simulation, only of the query problem at the end where I want an arbitrary, this pressure at an arbitrary point, correct?
So you could, so for example, here you could train on a fixed low resolution and then tune on some high resolution data. But generally to get a good solution, yes, you would need anyway to run your solver actually at probably a much higher resolution than what we even feed to the model. And that's why it takes so long. And then you need to refine your mesh adaptively depending on the area, and it's very costly. And then, so you do need still to do this, and then we use this data, but once you have it, you can just one-shot predict the output instead of having to run your full simulation for each instance. And so yeah, these were just some prediction from the model. So it actually achieved very low error. So just given a geometry, just predicts the surface pressure and the drag. And here you can see a visualization of where the error is located, and it's obviously in the most discontinuous areas, in the most rigorous areas.
So the previous slide, how do you determine points of grid are inside of surface or outside of surface or on
the regular grid?
Yeah,
so the regular grid is just a latent space. So we just sample uniformly on the whole space. And it's like we kind of just assume it's like a latent representation that the network works on. And at the end, we just project back to the actual
surface.
Yeah. I should mention that one of the inputs we feed is an SDF as well, so sign distance function. And so yeah, this is just then cost accuracy trade-off curve where we predicted the drag using our model versus the time it takes with OpenFOAM simulator. And yeah, there are two curves for the Geno. One is just using the Geno to measure the surface pressure, and then from this we measure the drag. The other one is we actually compute the drag and use this as a loss to improve our model. And so, as you can see, the model can reach similar accuracies. It's just a lot faster once you've trained because the simulation takes a long time. And so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but just briefly, all of this was learning from data. So we assume you have already some data if you got, for example, from a numerical solver, and then you use this to train your model. You could, if you know the equation that govern the system, you could also consider plugging them into your model. So you still train your neural operator. You take your input initial conditions, predict your function, your output function, and then given that you know the equations, you could plug that solution into the equation and use whatever error the model is making as a loss. And then you could backpropagate through not just the data loss, but also the physics loss. And so if you do this, basically what you're doing is you can combine this operator learning phase where you learn from data with some instance fine-tuning, where for a fixed instance, you plug in the equation loss and you can fine-tune to the point where it basically perfectly matches the actual spectrum. So here they also trained, they fine-tuned the model on specific instances using the physics loss. And as a result, the model was basically perfectly learning to predict targets. So yeah, so far I've covered basically the theory of neural operators, how we can apply them to regular grid, spherical grid, and arbitrary geometries. One thing is that they're efficient, but no matter what, we end up hitting a limit of hardware at some point, whether it's like memory limitation, bandwidth limitation, energy limitation. And so, yeah, as Gregorius know, I think when we were both doing our PhDs, I started working a bit on tensor methods, really liked it. So I felt like I have to mention it in every talk. And so, yeah, the idea is that, so, okay, tensor methods, by tensor here, I just mean multilinear array, like multidimensional array. So just generalizes the concept of a matrix to higher order. So matrix would be a 2D array, a tensor could be 3 or more dimensional. And then you can generalize the concept of matrix multiplication to tensor contraction. Instead of just multiplying a matrix on the right or the left, you just contract a tensor with another tensor along one or many dimensions. And so equipped with this, you can generalize concepts such as matrix decomposition. So if you apply like a SVD decomposition, for example, or any type of decomposition, you basically express your original matrix as a sum of rank 1 matrices, where each rank 1 matrix is an outer product of 2 vectors. And so you can do exactly the same for the tensor case. Instead, each rank 1 tensor is just an outer product of 3 or more vectors. And this is basically the CP, or canonical polyadic decomposition. And then if you want to do something more similar to maybe higher order SVD, or also called the Tucker decomposition, it's basically the same, but now you have a core tensor that is low dimensional. And unlike in the SVD, it doesn't have to be super diagonal. It can actually be dense. And so you can directly plug all this into the Fourier neural operator. So the thing is in the Fourier neural operator, because the data we're manipulating is multidimensional, so are our weights. And so you cannot directly apply matrix decomposition. So if you wanted to compress your model to have less parameters to train, you could consider applying, for example, an SVD and just training those low rank components. But because they're tensors, you cannot directly apply SVD. So you could either flatten your tensor into a very thin or very tall matrix, but that would not be optimal, or you can just directly decompose that tensor. And so, yeah, here we decompose basically the tensor weights of a Fourier neural operator. So those were like 4D, but you can also compress them jointly, in which case this becomes a big 5D tensor that has all the models of your model, all the parameters of your model. And then you train everything end to end as you would before. And during the forward pass, either you reconstruct your full weights from the factorized way and you do a regular forward pass, or you directly contract the input with the factors of the decomposition. We also had some multi-grid domain decomposition here, which is just a way of basically parallelizing the computation. And so just doing this actually allows you to significantly compress the model. So here there are 3 things. We just took a regular FNO, which we're training on some Navier-Stokes problem, and we're plotting the Sobolev and the L2 loss. And as you can see, the original FNO was doing well. It was like about 1.2% relative L2 error. By just improving the architecture and bringing in some traditional deep learning improvements like normalization, etc., we decreased it a lot. And then by just adding this tensor decomposition of the weights, we're able to further compress and actually get better performance. So it seems that this low rank structure has some regularizing effect on the learning. So yeah, this is just to see that if you just trim instead of compressing it, performance decreases very quickly. So here, the dashed line is the baseline performance, and you can see that you can compress the model using tensor decomposition a lot while having still similar or better accuracy. While if you just trim the network, performance degrades very rapidly. So that was compressing the weights. Another avenue for optimizing deep learning on neural operator models is actually looking at the gradients. So people often just think of the models when they look at optimization, but actually when you're training your model, you need to store all the intermediate activations, all the gradients, and then also your optimizer may be storing additional parameters. For example, if you're using Adam, you might have a moment estimates of the gradients, momentum, etc. So these actually take a lot of the memory. And so there's a method called Galore that was developed in Meta and Caltech that essentially compresses those gradients. So instead of storing the gradients, you do an SVD. You use this to project your gradients into a low-rank space, and then you do all the optimizer computation in this low-rank space. And then when it comes time to actually update your parameter, you just project back your gradient to the original size by inverting the projection. And so the problem is, once again, once you go to a neural operator or problems where you have multidimensional gradients, you cannot directly do this. And either you have to reshape your gradients into a matrix, in which case you lose a lot of information, try to learn higher order SVD and use that to project into smaller gradients. And then you do the same, do all the updates in the low rank space, and then project back at the end. And so this actually allows you to have similar or better performance once again, but with a fraction of the memory usage. So if you're GPU limited, that's a very easy one to just plug in. And as you can see, you significantly decrease the space it takes to store the gradients and the optimizer state. And performance doesn't really suffer. And you can see that if you use the matrix case, the orange line at the top here, performance suffers a lot more than if you use tensor case, because obviously you would have to choose how you reshape your gradients, and that will actually be wasting a lot of information. Yes.
So if you like just tensor decomposition or compression of the weight source gradient, every time you want to do a forward pass, you like recombine all the factors. Is it going to be a bit of a computational work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's what I was mentioning. So you have two choices. Either you reconstruct your full weight during the forward pass, or you keep recompressing the weight and you do a regular forward pass. Or if you think of like a matrix decomposition, if you're multiplying a dense matrix with a factorized one, you don't have to reconstruct your full matrix and multiply the two. You could just multiply sequentially and find the optimal order in which to do your multiplication. You can do the same for the tensor case and directly contract your inputs with the factors of the decomposition. So that would be faster. And then actual speed up would depend on how it's implemented, arithmetic intensity on hardware. So it's not necessarily easy to get, but at least you can reduce the memory use. And in practice, the runtime, even if you reconstruct the full matrix, is the same because the reconstruction time is negligible compared to the rest of the computation. So yeah, that was a little interlude on how to improve computational efficiency. So if your memory limited, that may be easy method to implement. And the last thing I wanted to cover is just our open source software work. I think, yeah, it's quite important, especially as we do more advanced work, to kind of try to democratize all this work. So we're trying to do this by distributing all the work in open source libraries. So the main one is called just Neural Operator, and it's a BSD license. So basically you can use it for whatever application you want, commercial, like analytic or whatever. And the goal is to basically keep the tools to train neural operators. So it's built on PyTorch, directly integrates with PyTorch, and you can just import the models, feed in your data, and you can feed in data at different resolution. It will automatically take care of the discretization invariance, and then you can just train them end to end. So we provide some simple data sets. We're now trying to integrate with other data sets. Like, I don't know if you've heard of it, there's this paper called The Well that kind of introduces like 15 terabytes or so of data. We're trying to integrate with those as well. And then we provide transform to normalize the data, all the layers I described here and some more, and then all the models. And then we have some trainers just train everything in here. So yeah, it's open source and just available on GitHub. And it implements all the methods in particular that I presented today. And then for the actual tensor algebra, it's also open source. It's a package called TensorLink that I actually started back in my PhD, and that, yeah, once again implements all the methods I presented. So yeah, that was everything I wanted to cover. Basically, and neural operators are just principled algorithms for resolution agnostic learning. So whenever you want to learn mapping between function spaces, you can modify your traditional neural network to stay discretization convergent, and they can enable very large speedups while maintaining accuracy. And if you're memory limited, tensor methods probably can. That was all from me. I want to thank, of course, all the wonderful collaborators with whom we've done a lot of these works. And yeah, thank you very much for joining me this lunchtime.